Imagine a journey filled with mysteries, marked by powerful symbols and enigmatic characters. The three wise men, or the wise men who followed the Star of Bethlehem, have captivated the world for centuries. But who were these men? Where did they come from? And what motivated them to traverse great distances to find a newborn baby in such a humble place? To answer these questions, we need to look beyond the simple biblical account and delve into the depths of esoteric traditions and spiritual interpretations that surround their journey. The Gospel of Matthew is the only biblical source that mentions the Magi. Interestingly, it does not call them kings, nor does it specify how many there were. The description is vague: men from the east who followed a star to find and worship the King of the Jews. This lack of detail has left room for interpretations and speculations over the centuries. Popular tradition has fixed the number at 3, perhaps due to the 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But some scholars believe there may be more to this story than that. Historically, the term Magi designated a class of Persian priest astronomers, followers of spiritual wisdom and the study of the stars. This suggests that these men were not merely nobles or kings, but possibly scholars and mystics who deeply understood the mysteries of the cosmos. In this sense, their journey to Jesus represents something much greater than a simple act of devotion. It was a quest for a higher truth, for a spiritual revelation that would change the course of humanity. And of course, we have the star, a star unlike any other, capable of guiding these wise men across long distances, leading them directly to the location of Jesus' birth. The Star of Bethlehem is another element filled with mystery. Could it have been a real astronomical phenomenon? A conjunction of planets, perhaps, or a supernova? Or are we dealing with a spiritual symbol, a divine sign meant to awaken not just the Magi, but all of humanity? If we consider history from an esoteric perspective, the star can represent something much deeper. In spiritual tradition, light is often a symbol of inner enlightenment, of a divine call that guides the soul towards the truth. Thus, the journey of the Magi can be seen as a metaphor for the human soul's quest for enlightenment, for divine wisdom. The star they followed can be interpreted as the inner guide we all have, pointing to the true nature of Christ, not just as an earthly king, but as a being of light destined to usher in a new age of spiritual consciousness. Another intriguing aspect is the fact that these wise men came from the East. The East, throughout history, has been seen as a place of great mysteries and ancestral wisdom. In esoteric traditions, the East is often associated with the source of light, wisdom, and spiritual knowledge. Could it be that the Magi, with their Eastern wisdom, had an understanding of Christ that the Jews themselves did not yet possess? Were they the first to recognize the true spiritual nature of the kingdom that Jesus would bring? This meeting of cultures and traditions is another fascinating point. The Magi represent the encounter between the East and the West, between the old and the new, between ancient wisdom and the revelation of something entirely unprecedented. They were not Jews, but they recognized something in the birth of Jesus that resonated deeply with their own spiritual understanding. This leads us to reflect. Does the story of the Magi teach us that spiritual truth transcends cultural and religious boundaries? That divine wisdom can be found in all traditions if we look with the right eyes? Finally, the first part of our journey leaves us with a fundamental question. What were the Magi really looking for? They followed a star, yes, but what did this search represent for them? Was it a search for an earthly king, or for a much deeper and universal truth? The answer to this question can help us understand not only who these wise men were, but also what each of us is looking for in our own spiritual journey. Now that we've started to unravel the mystery of the three wise men, we are ready to continue the investigation and delve even deeper into their origins and the spiritual nature of their quest. Each step leads us to new questions, new mysteries to be explored. As we delve deeper into the history of the three wise men, one of the most intriguing questions that arises is, where did these men come from? Christian tradition places them in the East, but this description is vague and leaves room for various interpretations. Were they priests from Persia, nobles from Arabia, or perhaps wise men from even more distant regions, such as India? To answer these questions, we need to consider not only the geographical context, but also the spiritual and esoteric one. One of the most accepted theories is that the Magi may have come from Persia, home to an ancient tradition of astrologers and priests known as Zoroastrians. Zoroaster, the Persian prophet, had founded a religion based on the dualism between good and evil, with a strong emphasis on the stars and the power of light. Zoroastrianism, like many other Eastern religions, believed that the heavens were a reflection of divine forces and that astrological signs could reveal important events on Earth. If the Magi were, in fact, Zoroastrians, their journey to Bethlehem may have been motivated by this belief, in which the star announced the coming of a great spiritual leader. Furthermore, the practice of astrology was highly respected in the East. Astrologers were consulted by kings and nobles in times of crisis or to make major decisions. Thus, the Magi could have been royal advisors, high-status individuals who were accustomed to interpreting celestial signs to guide the destinies of their rulers. However, what makes this story peculiar is the fact that the Magi, unlike other astrologers, were not just predicting future events. They were willing to physically follow the sign they saw in the skies, traveling great distances to discover its true meaning. But besides Persia, another possible origin of the Magi is Arabia. The gift of myrrh, which they offered to Jesus, was highly valued in Arabia, a land known for its rich spices and aromatic products. Some scholars suggest that the Magi could have come from some Arabian kingdom, bringing with them these symbolic gifts. Arabia, like Persia, also had a strong tradition of astrology and mysticism, which reinforces the possibility that these wise men were, in fact, scholars of the stars and spiritual mysteries. There are also those who suggest that the Magi could have come from even more distant lands, such as India. India was known for its ancient spiritual and philosophical traditions, and many of its teachings shared common points with Zoroastrianism and other Eastern philosophies. Could the Magi be representatives of the ancient Indian schools of wisdom, seeking in the birth of Jesus a manifestation of the universal truth that transcends cultural and religious barriers? This theory, although less popular, makes us reflect on the universality of Jesus' message and how it may have resonated with different spiritual traditions from the beginning. The number 3, often associated with the Magi, is also a point of great curiosity. Why 3? Were there really 3 men, or is this number just a symbol? In Christian tradition, the number 3 carries strong symbolic connotation, representing the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. However, the Bible never specifies how many Magi visited Jesus. There could have been 2, 4, or even more. The number 3, then, may have been a later choice, reflecting the need to align the event with deeper spiritual meanings. Another aspect that reinforces the idea that the Magi had a very rich spiritual origin is the symbolism of the gifts they brought: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These items were not only valuable offerings from a material point of view, but they also carried profound esoteric meanings. The gold, traditionally associated with royalty, symbolized the recognition of Jesus as king. The frankincense, often used in religious rituals, represented his divinity. And the myrrh, used for embalming bodies, pointed to the suffering and death that Jesus would face. Thus, these gifts reveal that the Magi had a deep understanding not only of earthly power, but also of the spiritual and the sacrificial. And then we have the matter of the East. Why this region of the world? The East has been associated, throughout history, with a source of wisdom and enlightenment. Many of the oldest spiritual traditions, including Hinduism, Buddhism, and Zoroastrianism itself, were born in the East. In esoteric texts, the East is often referred to as the place from where light comes, both literally and metaphorically. In this sense, the Magi might have been the first of many to recognize that the coming of Christ represented the birth of a new spiritual light for humanity. The journey of the Magi, therefore, can be seen not only as a physical pilgrimage, but also as a spiritual quest. They were not merely following a star. They were in search of a greater truth, a revelation that transcended their own traditions and cultures. The star they followed was both an outward manifestation and a symbol of their inner quest for enlightenment and understanding. Finally, the different theories about the origin of the Magi show us that, regardless of their exact origin, they symbolize something much larger, the universal quest for wisdom and truth. Perhaps representing the three great cultures of the time, Persian, Arab, and Indian, the Magi reflect the unity of all peoples around a common spiritual truth. Their story invites us to reflect on how spiritual wisdom transcends geographical and cultural boundaries, uniting all those in search of light. Now that we have explored the mysterious origins of the Magi, we are ready to proceed with the next part, unraveling the mystery of the Star of Bethlehem and what it may have truly represented. One of the greatest mysteries in the history of the three wise men is the star that guided them to the exact place of Jesus' birth. The Star of Bethlehem, as it became known, has been the subject of speculation throughout the centuries, with theories ranging from astronomical explanations to deeply spiritual interpretations. But what was this star? A rare natural phenomenon or a divine sign loaded with esoteric symbolism? The first approach to solving this riddle comes from science. Many astronomers and historians have tried to find an explanation for the star in the night sky of the time. One of the most popular theories is that the Star of Bethlehem may have been a planetary conjunction, a close alignment of planets that to Earth observers would look like a single bright point of light. Specifically, the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, which occurred around the year 7 BC, is often cited as a possible explanation. This alignment would have been visible in the eastern sky and would have attracted the attention of experienced observers like the Magi. Another scientific explanation suggests that the star could have been a supernova, a stellar explosion that creates an intense glow in the sky, visible for days or even months. A supernova could have caught the attention of the Magi and guided their journey. However, there are no reliable records of a visible supernova at the time Jesus was born, which makes this theory less likely. Another hypothesis is that the star could have been a comet, as comets have traditionally been seen as omens of significant events. But again, there are no compelling records of a comet during this period that could explain the Star of Bethlehem. However, these astronomical explanations do not capture the entire mystery surrounding the Star of Bethlehem. For many scholars and mystics, the star was not just a simple natural phenomenon, but rather a powerful spiritual symbol. In esoteric tradition, stars represent divine light, the cosmic wisdom that guides humanity. The journey of the Magi can be seen as a spiritual quest, and the star as a reflection of their own inner enlightenment. In this context, the Star of Bethlehem would symbolize the spiritual awakening that Jesus would bring to the world, a light that not only shines in the sky, but also in the hearts of those who seek the truth. This symbolism is present in various spiritual traditions. In esoteric Christianity, the Star of Bethlehem is often interpreted as a symbol of the inner Christ, the divine presence that dwells within each of us. Just as the Magi followed the star to find Jesus, We too are called to follow the inner light, to find our own connection with the divine. This interpretation suggests that the journey of the Magi was not just a physical pilgrimage, but a metaphor for the spiritual journey that we all must undertake in search of truth and enlightenment. The idea that the Star of Bethlehem was a spiritual symbol becomes even stronger when we consider the role of astrology in antiquity. The Magi, likely being astrologers or priests who observed the heavens, would have been highly sensitive to celestial signs. To them, the stars were not just heavenly bodies, but divine messengers. Astrology at that time was not seen as an isolated science, but as a way to understand the divine plan through the heavens. In this sense, the Star of Bethlehem could have been a sign not just of an astronomical event, but of a profound spiritual shift, the birth of a new era. Another fascinating aspect to consider is the role of stars in various mystical traditions. In many ancient cultures, stars were seen as portals to the divine, places where the souls of the wise and the righteous resided after death. In Zoroastrianism, for instance, the wise believed that stars represented pure souls who had achieved enlightenment. If the Magi were indeed followers of Zoroastrianism, they would have seen the Star of Bethlehem as a clear sign that a divine soul had incarnated on earth. The star can also be seen as a symbol of spiritual guidance. Just as the Magi followed the star to find Jesus, many of us seek a spiritual guide to direct us on our own life journeys. The Star of Bethlehem can then be interpreted as an archetype of the spiritual master, who appears at the right time to lead us to our destiny. Jesus, as the Christ, is often considered this master, the light that illuminates the path for all those who seek the truth. Finally, there is an even deeper mystical interpretation. The Star of Bethlehem was not an external phenomenon, but an internal event. For mystics, true enlightenment does not come from outside, but from within. The star, in this sense, could represent the awakening of divine consciousness in the hearts of the Magi, an inner call to recognize and worship the Christ who was not only born in Bethlehem, but who also is born within each of us when we are ready to receive him. As the Magi followed the star, they were not just seeking an earthly king, but a greater spiritual revelation. The star led them to a new understanding of the divine, to the realization that Christ brought a light that transcended earthly power and inaugurated a new era of spiritual consciousness. The star then represents this awakening, the moment each of us begins to see beyond appearances and recognize the divine presence in everything around us. And so, we conclude this part of the mystery. The Star of Bethlehem is not just a matter of science or astronomy, but a profound symbol of enlightenment, guidance, and spiritual transformation. Now, we are ready to move forward and see how this journey unfolded, leading the Magi to meet with Herod and to the messianic prophecies. The journey of the Magi led them to Jerusalem, where they had a crucial encounter with King Herod. This meeting marks a turning point in the narrative, not only because of the escalating tension it creates, but also for the layers of symbolism and messianic prophecies it reveals. Upon arriving in Jerusalem, the Magi sought the King of the Jews, a term that immediately sparked interest and fear in Herod, a ruler known for his strict control over power. The first thing to consider is the reason why the Magi sought Herod. In their search for the newborn king, it seems natural that they would head to the capital and the royal palace. However, this also shows us that, despite their wisdom, the Magi were, to some extent, still limited by an earthly view of what it means to be a king. They assumed that the new king would be born in a place of power and wealth, reflecting the expectation of an earthly Messiah who would rule over Israel. This initial misconception is significant, as it reveals to us that even those who are wise and enlightened can be blind to the deepest spiritual mysteries until the truth is revealed to them. Herod, in turn, reacts with a blend of surprise and fear. The mention of a king of the Jews immediately sparks in Herod the fear of a threat to his power. He, who had already eliminated many members of his own family to maintain control over the throne, now saw the birth of this new king as a direct threat to his authority. This leads us to reflect on the deeper symbolism of this encounter. Herod represents the power of the ego, the domain of temporal force that fears being replaced by something higher and spiritual. The kingdom of Herod is the kingdom of matter, of control, and he fears being dethroned by the light of a new kingdom, the spiritual kingdom of Jesus. Here comes the role of the ancient messianic prophecies. The priests and scribes that Herod consulted in search of answers point to the prophecy of Micah, which stated that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. This prophecy is significant because, besides predicting the birthplace of Jesus, it also emphasizes the humble nature of his kingdom. Instead of being born in a large and powerful city like Jerusalem, the Messiah would be born in a small and insignificant town like Bethlehem. This reflects the inversion of expectations we see throughout Jesus' story. Spiritual power is not in wealth and palaces, but in humility and service. Herod, however, was not interested in understanding the spiritual meaning of these prophecies. Instead, he used the information he received to try to deceive the Magi. He asked that, after finding the boy, they return to inform him, claiming that he also wanted to worship the new king. But of course, his intentions were sinister. Herod planned to eliminate this potential threat to his throne, even if it meant killing an innocent child. This adds a dark layer to the narrative, showing how earthly power often tries to destroy what it cannot control or understand. The symbolism of this encounter also extends to the idea of choice. Herod and the Magi represent two different paths, the path of the ego and the path of spiritual enlightenment. Herod chooses fear, insecurity, and the desire to maintain his earthly power at any cost. The Magi, on the other hand, are in search of the truth and are guided by the light of the star, a metaphor for the inner quest for wisdom and enlightenment. In this sense, the encounter between Herod and the Magi can be seen as a reflection of the choice we all face, to follow the light or to cling to fear and control. The interaction between Herod and the Magi also raises an important question about the role of prophecies. For many at the time, the awaited Messiah was seen as a political leader who would liberate Israel from Roman rule and restore the power of the Jewish people. However, the prophecies were always deeper than that. They pointed to a spiritual kingdom, not a kingdom of military or political strength. Jesus, as the Messiah, did not come to conquer nations with swords, but to bring a new way of life based on love, compassion, and inner transformation. This truth, however, was hard to understand, both for Herod and for many others. The Magi, being foreigners, also reveal something important about the universality of Jesus' message. They were not Jews, but they recognized something of great value in Jesus' birth, something that transcended cultural and religious barriers. This reflects the truth that the spiritual kingdom Jesus came to inaugurate was not just for one nation or people, but for all humanity. The messianic prophecies, therefore, point to a universal truth. The light of Christ shines for everyone, regardless of their origin or belief. The symbolism of the Magi's journey also takes on a new meaning here. By leaving Jerusalem, they are, in a sense, leaving behind earthly expectations about the Messiah. By following the star to Bethlehem, they are drawing closer to a deeper spiritual truth, a new understanding of what it means to be a king and what it means to be the Messiah. This transition from the big city to the small village of Bethlehem reflects the shift from a limited and materialistic view of power to a higher and spiritual understanding. Finally, this encounter with Herod lays the groundwork for the upcoming conflict. Herod represents the resistance of the ego, the desire to control and destroy what cannot be controlled. But the journey of the Magi teaches us that, even in the face of powerful forces trying to prevent the advancement of light, spiritual truth prevails. They continue their quest, guided by the star, and refuse to let fear or manipulation divert them from their goal. This part of the story leaves us with an important lesson. In our own spiritual journey, we often encounter Herods along the way, forces that try to discourage us, distract us, or even make us give up our search for the truth. However, like the Magi, we are called to continue following the light, regardless of the obstacles that may arise. After a long journey, guided by the star's light and the promise of prophecies, the Magi finally arrived in Bethlehem. However, the scene that awaited them was very different from what they probably expected. Instead of a sumptuous palace, they found the King of the Jews in a humble manger, surrounded by simplicity and poverty. This striking contrast between earthly expectations and spiritual reality is one of the most powerful moments in the narrative, both in historical and symbolic terms. The first thing to note is the inversion of expectations that occurs here. The Magi, coming from distant lands and laden with valuable gifts, probably imagined finding a king born under grand circumstances. However, what they find is a humble child, born in a stable, surrounded by animals. This scene reveals a profound spiritual truth. The greatness of God's kingdom does not lie in material power or luxury, but in humility and a spirit of service. The manger, with its simplicity, symbolizes the new type of kingdom that Jesus came to establish, a kingdom based on love, compassion, and equality. The meeting between the Magi and the baby Jesus is, in itself, full of meanings. Upon recognizing Christ, the Magi did not hesitate to prostrate themselves before him, demonstrating a profound act of reverence. This gesture is symbolic not only of the adoration of a king, but of the recognition of something much greater. They recognized, at that moment, that Jesus' spiritual power surpassed any earthly power they knew. Their wisdom and studies led them there, but it was the heart, not the intellect, that recognized the divinity in that baby. At this point, another deep symbolism comes into play: the gifts that the Magi brought. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh are often interpreted as material symbols, but their spiritual implications go much further. Gold, traditionally associated with royalty, is a symbol of recognizing Jesus as the King of Kings, the one who would rule not with swords, but with divine justice. Gold represents spiritual enlightenment, the light of Christ that shines in all hearts. The incense, in turn, is a symbol of worship and spirituality. In antiquity, incense was used in religious rituals to elevate prayers to the heavens. By offering incense to Jesus, the Magi acknowledge his divinity and the role of mediator between humanity and the divine. This gift also points to the sacred nature of his mission, suggesting that Jesus was not just an earthly king, but the very Son of God. Myrrh, perhaps the most intriguing gift, was used for embalming bodies, a funerary practice in antiquity. Offering myrrh to a newborn seems, at first glance, a strange gesture. However, this gift is a foreshadowing of the sacrifice that Jesus would later make in his life. Myrrh symbolizes Jesus' mortality and anticipates his passion and death on the cross. Thus, from the moment of his birth, his destiny of suffering that he would face to save humanity was already being announced. The symbolism of these gifts goes beyond mere recognition of Jesus' identity. They also represent the spiritual journey that we all undertake. Gold symbolizes the quest for self-knowledge and enlightenment. Incense represents spiritual awakening, the recognition of the divine within ourselves and in the world around us. And myrrh reminds us that, To achieve true enlightenment, it is necessary to go through sacrifice, not necessarily in the physical sense, but in the sense of renouncing ego, materialism, and the illusions of the world. Furthermore, the delivery of these gifts reinforces the universal role of Jesus. He did not come just for one people or one nation, but for all of humanity. The Magi, coming from distant lands and representing different cultures, symbolize this truth. They recognize that the birth of Jesus was not a local event, but an occurrence that would impact the entire world. This invites us to reflect on the universal message of Christ, which transcends cultural, religious, and geographical boundaries. The meeting of the Magi with Jesus also signifies a profound transformation in their lives. Upon seeing Christ, they were no longer the same. Their spiritual quest had reached its climax, but at the same time, it had also marked the beginning of a new phase in their lives. They had found what they were looking for, but in doing so, they realized that this truth was much larger than they could have ever imagined. This is the beauty of the spiritual quest. The closer we get to the truth, the more it transforms us and opens us up to new dimensions of understanding. Another important aspect of this moment is the contrast between the reaction of the Magi and that of Herod. While Herod saw Jesus as a threat to his power and was filled with fear and distrust, the Magi were filled with reverence and joy. They recognized that Jesus' power was not a threat to the material world, but the promise of a new way of life, based on higher spiritual principles. This contrast reminds us that often, our reactions to the divine depend on where we are in our spiritual journey. While some see the light as a threat to their ego, others welcome it as the path to liberation. Finally, the Magi's encounter with Jesus is a reminder that the spiritual journey, though long and full of challenges, always culminates in a revelation. Just as the Magi followed the star to the end and found Christ, we too are called to follow our own inner light, trusting that it will guide us to the truth we seek. This moment not only concludes the Magi's journey, but also inspires us to continue our own quest, with the certainty that, at the right time, we too will find the revelation we seek. With the delivery of the gifts and the recognition of Christ, the Magi complete their mission, but their story is far from over. Now we must explore what happens next. The Magi's escape to avoid Herod and the beginning of a new phase in their spiritual lives. After finding Christ and delivering their gifts, the Magi were ready to return and fulfill the promise they had made to King Herod, to inform him of the whereabouts of the newborn King of the Jews. However, during the night, the Magi received a warning in a dream not to return to Herod. They understood then that their good intentions were being manipulated by a darker force. Herod did not want to worship the new king. He wanted to eliminate him. This dream, sent as a divine warning, was crucial to the unfolding of the story. The Magi, guided up until then by the star, were now guided by an inner voice, an intuition or, as many believe, a direct message from the divine. Thus, instead of returning to Jerusalem and obeying Herod's orders, they took another path. This decision reveals something profound about the spiritual journey. Often, when we follow the truth, we are forced to change direction, to abandon old ways, and, in some cases, to disobey earthly authorities that would lead us to destruction. The escape of the Magi symbolically represents the protection of what is sacred. They knew that if they revealed the location of Jesus, it would result in his death at the hands of Herod. The route they took back home, away from the king's sight, reflects the importance of protecting the inner light, the sacred knowledge, from those seeking to destroy it. This theme is recurring in esoteric traditions. Secrecy and silence are often the best ways to protect what is most spiritually valuable. But what were the Magi protecting, exactly? not just the physical Christ, but also the spiritual principle he represented. Jesus was, from his birth, a symbol of a new era, a new light being born into the world. By not revealing the child's whereabouts, the Magi were, in a way, protecting this light from being extinguished before its time. This leads us to reflect on how, in our own lives, we should protect the inner truth we find, especially when it is threatened by external forces trying to snuff it out. Meanwhile, Herod's fate begins to unfold. When he realizes that the Magi have deceived him and have not returned to inform him about Jesus' whereabouts, Herod becomes furious. His fear of losing power leads him to make one of the cruelest decisions of his life: the order to kill all boys in Bethlehem under 2 years of age. This act, known as the Massacre of the Innocents, is one of the darkest episodes in the history of Christmas. It symbolizes the violence and brutality of the ego which, faced with the threat of being replaced by something greater and brighter, resorts to destruction. The slaughter of the innocents reveals a profound spiritual conflict. Herod, who represents the power of the ego and matter, desperately tries to maintain his control. He fails to understand that Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, that the power Christ would bring could not be measured in terms of thrones or armies. This spiritual blindness of Herod, his attachment to earthly power, is what leads him to commit such barbaric acts. He is incapable of recognizing the true nature of God's kingdom and, as a result, acts with violence and fear. This event also carries significant esoteric symbolism. The innocents that Herod kills can be seen as symbols of our own spiritual hopes and aspirations that are often destroyed by fear and ignorance. Herod acts rashly, destroying what he does not understand, in the same way that our ego often tries to destroy what it cannot control. The massacre of the innocents, therefore, represents the internal struggle we all face when trying to protect our inner light from the forces of ego and fear. But despite Herod's brutality, the story does not end with his victory. The light of Christ survives, protected by divine forces. Joseph, Jesus' adoptive father, also receives a warning in a dream to flee with his family to Egypt. This movement has profound symbolism. Egypt, in the biblical tradition, was often seen as a place of refuge and exile. It was there that Joseph, the son of Jacob, and the people of Israel found refuge during times of famine. Now, Jesus, the new Joseph, finds safety in the same place. The flight to Egypt symbolizes the cycle of divine protection that surrounds those who are called for a spiritual mission. Jesus, still a baby, is being protected by celestial forces, just as his parents, guided by dreams and divine warnings, are fulfilling their role in safeguarding the future Messiah. The fact that the Magi fled by a different route and Jesus was taken to Egypt also reveals the need for adaptation and flexibility in spiritual journeys. Often, we cannot follow predictable paths, but must trust in intuition and the spiritual signs we receive. Herod, on the other hand, does not escape the consequences of his actions. Historically, it is known that he died shortly after the massacre of the innocents, tormented by diseases and the weight of his cruelty. His death symbolizes the inevitable fall of those who cling to material power at the expense of spiritual good. The ego may fight against the light, but, in the end, the light prevails. Herod, as a symbol of the ego, could not understand that the kingdom Jesus came to establish was eternal, while his own power was fleeting and doomed to failure. The fate of Herod reminds us that, despite the destructive forces that may try to lead us astray or oppress us, spiritual truth always triumphs. Even in the face of violence and chaos, the light of Christ was preserved, and his message of love and compassion would be revealed to the world. The Magi, in protecting this light and taking another path, also played a crucial role in this spiritual triumph. Finally, the escape of the Magi and the fate of Herod teach us that, in spiritual journeys, there are times when we are called to protect what is most sacred. The path will not always be easy, and often we will have to deal with forces that try to divert us from our mission. But just like the Magi followed their intuition and refused to betray Christ, we too are called to trust in our inner guides and to protect the truth we find in our lives. Now that the Magi have completed their mission and Herod's fate has been sealed, the story is ready to move towards its conclusion, where we will see how the return of the Magi symbolizes the transformation and new understanding they have achieved throughout this journey. After their silent escape, the Magi departed from Bethlehem towards their homelands. However, they were no longer the same men who had begun the journey. The search that started with the observation of a star and the expectation of finding an earthly king culminated in a spiritual revelation that transformed their lives forever. Now, as they returned by another route, they carried not only the experience of meeting Christ, but a new understanding of the meaning of royalty, power, and spiritual truth. The fact that the Magi chose a different path to return is not just a practical decision to avoid Herod, but it also carries deep symbolism. In the spiritual journey, once we find the truth, we can no longer go back the same way. We are transformed, and our perspective of the world is altered. This is a universal principle in esoteric traditions. Spiritual knowledge leads us in new directions, opening doors we couldn't see before. For the Magi, this transformation is reflected in their choice to avoid Jerusalem and return to their homes by a different route. The return journey, therefore, represents a spiritual rebirth. The Magi had followed the star, guided by their traditions and the knowledge they possessed. However, what they found in Bethlehem was something beyond their expectations. They not only found a king, but a divine revelation. This encounter brought about an internal change that would now influence their lives and the ways they saw the world. Just like everyone who goes through a profound spiritual experience, they could not return to their old ways of thinking and living. Here we can explore the esoteric concept of initiation. In many mystical traditions, initiation is the moment when the individual is introduced to a new level of consciousness or wisdom. For the Magi, their encounter with Jesus was this initiation. They, who were wise in their own lands, had now been introduced to a higher knowledge, the light of Christ, which illuminated not just the earth, but also their hearts. This initiation marked the beginning of a new phase in their lives, where they would live in accordance with this new truth they had discovered. Another interesting aspect of their return is the fact that the Magi return as messengers of a universal truth. Although they were foreigners, coming from different cultures, they now carried within them the message of Christ, a message that transcends borders. Their journey can be seen as a symbol of the spreading of spiritual light beyond the borders of Judaism, reaching all nations and peoples. Just as they were guided to Bethlehem by the star, they now carried this light back to their own people. This invites us to reflect on the role of spiritual messengers in our own life. Like the Magi, we are called to carry the light we find and share it with the world. Often, the transformation we experience on our spiritual journey is not just for our personal benefit, but so we can be a channel of light for others. The return of the Magi, therefore, represents the beginning of this mission, to bring knowledge of the divine to those who are still in the dark. Another important aspect to consider is the Magi's change in perception of power. At the beginning of their journey, they were seeking an earthly king, someone who would rule with power and authority. But what they found was a humble boy, born in simple circumstances, without any outward sign of royalty. This profound contrast forever changed their view of what it means to be a king. Jesus' power was not in ruling over territories or armies, but in spiritual power, in the ability to transform hearts and souls. This realization changed the way the Magi viewed power and, most likely, would influence their actions when they returned to their own kingdoms. The gold, frankincense, and myrrh that the Magi offered to Jesus now take on a new meaning. If before these gifts were symbols of honor and reverence, now we can see them as reflections of his own transformation. The gold, symbolizing royalty, now represents the recognition of the inner kingdom, of the spiritual power that each one of us carries. The frankincense, a symbol of divinity, represents the Magi's connection with the divine, not just in the external sense, but also internally. The myrrh, a symbol of mortality, reminds us of the transience of earthly life and the importance of seeking what is eternal. The return of the Magi also reflects the importance of action in the world after the spiritual experience. The spiritual journey does not end with the revelation, but continues with the application of this new knowledge in everyday life. The Magi, upon returning to their lands, carried with them the responsibility to live according to the truth they had discovered. This teaches us that spiritual awakening is not an end in itself, but the beginning of a transformed life, where our actions reflect what we have learned on our inner journey. Another crucial point is the fact that the Magi probably did not share all the details of their journey with others upon returning. Just like in many spiritual traditions, certain truths are revealed in a sacred and personal way and cannot always be openly shared. This hidden wisdom is preserved and lived in silence. This does not mean hiding the truth, but recognizing that certain spiritual experiences are so profound that they can only be truly understood by those who have also walked the path. The journey of the Magi, then, ends on a note of mystery. We know that they returned to their lands, but what happened afterwards is left to the imagination. Perhaps they became spiritual leaders in their own cultures, or maybe they continued their lives in a more humble way, but transformed by the light they found. Either way, one thing is certain. The journey they began by following the star led them to a place of profound understanding and transformation. This final part of your journey teaches us that returning to the world after a spiritual experience does not mean a return to the old. We are always changed, always transformed, and we carry this light with us wherever we go. The Magi, now messengers of this new light, show us that the spiritual journey never ends, but continues to guide us, even when we return to the place from which we came. Now that we have explored the return of the Magi and the transformative impact of their journey, we can move on to Part 8, where we will conclude the script by reflecting on the legacy of the Magi and the enduring significance of this story. The story of the three wise men is not just a biblical narrative about the birth of Jesus, but a profound symbol of spiritual transformation, faith, and wisdom that transcends time. The legacy of the Magi continues to resonate, offering lessons that remain as relevant today as they were over 2,000 years ago. Now, as we reach the end of our journey with them, it's time to reflect on the enduring significance of their story and the impact it can have on our own spiritual lives. The first and perhaps most important lesson we can draw from the journey of the Magi is the importance of the quest for truth. The Magi were wise men, scholars of the stars and spiritual traditions, and their journey began with a simple sign: a star. This sign, however, was not just a celestial phenomenon, but an inner call, an invitation to follow the path of spiritual discovery. What the Magi teach us is that, regardless of where we start, whether through a religious tradition, intellectual study, or deep intuition, we are all called to seek the truth with courage and dedication. Another important aspect of the Magi's legacy is the symbol of the Star of Bethlehem. For them, The star represented more than an outward sign. It was an inner light, a spiritual guide leading them to a higher understanding. Similarly, each of us has an inner star that guides us on our personal journey. This light can take the form of intuition, a spiritual experience, or even moments of deep reflection. The challenge, as the Magi teach us, is to follow this light, even when the path is unknown or filled with obstacles. The story of the Magi also offers us a powerful lesson about humility. Upon finding Jesus in such simple and humble circumstances, the Magi did not hesitate to prostrate themselves and worship the child. This act of reverence was not only an acknowledgement of his royalty, but also a lesson on how true spiritual power does not reside in luxury or material power, but in simplicity, purity, and truth. They show us that, to find the divine, we must be willing to set aside our earthly expectations and recognize the light in the humblest of places. The gifts that the Magi brought, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, also carry a lasting meaning. These gifts, at their core, represent the three central aspects of our own spiritual journey. Gold symbolizes inner royalty, the recognition of our own divinity, and the spiritual power that each of us carries. Frankincense, in turn, represents the connection with the divine, the worship and devotion that elevate us and bring us closer to God. And myrrh, with its symbolism of sacrifice, reminds us that the spiritual path often requires that we renounce aspects of our ego, face mortality, and accept the necessary transformations for our growth. Another essential aspect of the Magi's legacy is the universality of Jesus' message. The Magi, being foreigners and from different cultures, recognize something in Christ that transcends the boundaries of race, nationality, or religion. They are the first messengers that the light of Christ came not only for the Jews, but for all of humanity. This is a deeply inclusive message, inviting us to look beyond our differences and recognize the divine light in everyone, regardless of their origin. The return of the Magi to their homelands also carries an important message about life after a spiritual revelation. They did not return by the same path, symbolizing that once we find the truth, we cannot go back to being the same. The spiritual transformation they experienced was not a fleeting thing. It changed their lives forever. This teaches us that the true spiritual journey is not an isolated event, but a continuous process of change and growth. Once we find the light, we are called to live it in all areas of our life. Furthermore, the choice of the Magi to follow a different path to avoid Herod teaches us the importance of protecting what is sacred. They knew that Herod posed a threat to the light they had found, and therefore took measures to ensure its safety. This reminds us that, often, we too need to protect our own inner light from forces seeking to extinguish it, whether these forces are external, such as fear and oppression, or internal, like ego and doubt. Just like the Magi, we must be diligent in protecting what is most valuable within us. The fate of Herod, who tried to destroy Christ, serves as a reminder that ego and material power, when placed above the spiritual, are destined to fail. Herod symbolizes attachment to control and fear, while the Magi represent surrender and trust in divine wisdom. In the end, the light of Christ prevailed, and the journey of the Magi shows us that spiritual truth, once discovered, is indestructible, even in the face of the world's most powerful forces. Finally, the story of the Magi is a narrative of hope. They show us that, regardless of where we come from, or the hardships we encounter along the way, the pursuit of truth is always rewarded. The light we follow will guide us to revelation, and this revelation will transform us, giving us a new perspective on life and on ourselves. The story of the Magi encourages us to continue on our own spiritual journey, trusting that, just like them, we too will find the light we seek. The legacy of the Magi, therefore, is not just a story of faith, but a powerful metaphor for our own inner quest. They teach us to follow the star, to trust in the journey, to recognize divinity in the humble, and to protect what is sacred within us. And just as the Magi returned to their lands transformed, we are called to live according to the light we have found, sharing this truth with the world around us. And now, Mind Unfettered, it's your turn to share. Think about the journey of the three wise men. What were they really seeking? Could this quest be something we also pursue in our lives? Tell us in the comments. What is the star guiding your spiritual journey today? Share your thoughts, because when we connect and share our experiences, we help to manifest an even stronger collective light. And speaking of manifestation, don't stop here. The awakening of Christ consciousness is a continuous process, and what the Magi found in Jesus carries a hidden message that can change our spiritual understanding. Want to know more about this awakening? Click on the next video that is already appearing on your screen. Awakened Christ Consciousness, the hidden message of Jesus revealed, where we continue this journey of discovery. Remember, you are part of something bigger. Together, as the Mind Unfettered community, we are exploring and manifesting a new consciousness. So, let's continue this journey together. See you in the next video.